Eingeflickter the mended sock example that's found in Hegel's unpublished writings in his so-called, sometimes it's called the Waste Book, sometimes it's called the Notebook. I think it's auf Deutsch, it's the Notiz book. So that one can say this example doesn't come from something Hegel himself would place as part of his total teaching, but we've discovered it nonetheless. We could use it to sort of to cheat and not say here's. I mean, there's something. It has a red letter rubric over it. The word Hegel, 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 and it's not the man. It's a teaching. But this he hasn't included in that teaching. But nonetheless, like, we could look at it and say, does it actually mean exactly the same thing as in the strict reading that he said his known teachings, and how many remarks do we have to make it think that this is could be considered as normal Hegel, or as part of the canon of Hegelian thoughts, which are unimpeachable from the point of view of the philologists who interact with the Hegel and tell us what he was actually saying. But okay, instead here we're going to take the primary Methodos, or Hodos, as Heraclitus called it. Methodos, method, Aristotle used the word Methodos. And follow the seminar where again took part that Heidegger gave, where he gave a reverse claim. He claimed that there's a mistake in the manuscript in the Notiz book, and actually Hegel didn't mean to say that this mended sock is, Hegel didn't mean to say the common sense thing, the thing that's supposed to be common sense. The mended sock is better than the torn sock. Because the torn sock is just sitting there, you think maybe I should throw it away. But if you mend it, then you could wear it again and you don't have to spend money on the new sock. So the mended sock is better than a torn sock. That seems to be common sense. Heidegger claims no. If you look at the actual this mess, it's probably, I don't know, it's probably written in like some kind of cursive mess of writing or something. I'll look that up, but it will be too late. Okay, that doesn't really matter at all. It's just a side issue. But okay, what is the mended sock? This it's called the mended sock. Let's get overly complicated as though we're a mathematician. Let's call the mended sock by the title, but a mathematician with a fine aesthetic taste. And so then we go to, well, no, let's say with the popular aesthetic taste, even better. So we'll go to the poem about the promise to keep, about the man who said, I had a promise to keep, and it was to take it was to go on the path less taken. So let's say on one side the promise, or the common sense version, and then on the other side the to keep, or the strange. On the other side, let's say the other side is the less, pathless, P-A-T-H space L-E-S-S, the pathless. This is sort of a stupid pun or something, the pathless. Okay, so the promise and the pathless, one and the other. The promise is the common sense version, the sock's better when it's mended. That's the promise. But what about the pathless? The pathless is, Heidegger tells the Surprise Seminar, actually what this text of Hegel said, even though it's not part of his official teaching, as it's part of this waste book, so-called, was that the torn sock is better than so the negativity. The torn sock is better, but wait a second, it's not that stupid. Wait a second. The torn sock is better than the sock that you think you should just throw away is better than the mended sock. So what this means, according to the way Heidegger thinks about this, and the way Hegel thought about this, is what it's weird. There's a controversy over it that that I only came aware of in through reading Rum in Ingarden, is that it's a controversy that preceded Heidegger, really, I think, or in any case was with the first students of Husserl. It already arose, is that there's a question as Husserl is making this issue of the Natureinstellung and the theoretische Einstellung. And then they said, what do you mean by, what is this? To clarify this Einstellung business, which we usually customarily translate as natural attitude. And this becomes a problem with the students of Husserl already. But here, the promise versus, so we have this let's just say it, the natural attitude and the theoretical attitude, which is to say, the natural attitude corresponds to this notion that the amended sock is better, and the theoretical attitude is when it comes across. So we could recognize immediately the standard interpretation of Heidegger. So when it comes across the broken hammer, but in this case, when it comes across the sock that it looks like it ought to be thrown away or something, the torn sock, or the collocation where you can't hear anything because everybody's saying different things and nobody knows quite why the gathering has been called in the first place. Doppler effects are happening and so on, but it's not that stupid, really. If you think about it, it means something breaks in and people start saying, like the Greeks did, why are we doing things this way? So then you have this basic, just because we've done things this way before, maybe we shouldn't still do things attitude, which only really arises in the policies and very little in villages. In villages, there's not that much sense of deep time, or so we're told, but I believe it's actually shown to be true by long once you have long communications with people in a village, then you necessarily derange them because they become aware of what you're doing. It's like people in villages don't make surveys and don't try to find out what the Dasein character or the eigenperson character of people are. Sometimes they trade stuff with neighboring villages. Sometimes they have wars with neighboring villages. Sometimes they admire the neighboring. The early Greeks admired the Hittites, and therefore they gave, according to one Russian theory, the reason why, for instance, the word for blood in Iliad, in the written down version, which was written down around 600 BC by the Pisistrati, is the Hittite word Iker, is because the early Greeks were just awed and jaw-droppingly awed by the Hittites. So they said, the Hittite, they gave their Olympians some Hittite words and said, this is what the gods call this stuff, called blood. So we have a situation where in order to see the difference between the natural attitude and the theoretical attitude, we have recourse to this historical claim, which appears in Plato and Aristotle, that with the first cities, according to Plato, it doesn't make that much difference. This behavior was already kind of going on in the villages, but not really. But according to Aristotle, it's a total difference, because for the first time you have the possibility of schola, school, or what they call leisure. So it's like we act like a professor or whatever is actually doing work, but according to them, that's leisure. Schola is leisure. Yeah, so you get the juxtaposition for the first time of people like the Egyptian hierophants who are doing mathematics, both according to Plato and Aristotle, who first produced a theoretical view of things. And so Aristotle thinks that's an essential difference. It's a totally different being, as it were. And then thus the theory of eudaimonia follows from that. Whereas Plato thinks it's sort of like, it's a matter of degrees. It's more in the city, but it's more in the polis. But it was, but for this reason, Aristotle thinks that a certain degree of, that a city where you have some people that are in total leisure in the schools, just being professors or whatever, just giving lectures, that is essentially, it's, for Plato, it's still comparable to the village. For Aristotle, it's not. Yeah, so this is the difference between natural attitude and theoretical attitude. Is also a difference between the whole character of the people. So now we have again this. Let's look again at this example in why Heidegger takes the side of the Tornsock. So, yeah, first of all, I guess it's sort of touching in a way to notice that the scholars, including Agamben, who was very young at the time, all une voice, all of a voice, said, we don't know this version. We heard that there's something in the waste book of Hegel about a torn sock, but we know the natural version. We know the version where he takes the side of natural common sense. We don't know the version where he takes the side of negativity or this confused state that Heidegger calls the present stand, and then makes correspond to ousia, which Hegel does away with. Also, at the same time, ousia, and at the same time, or more clearly to me, the doctrine of nous, as we find it from Aristotle to Dugin. From Aristotle to Dugin, we find the doctrine of nous. But in Dugin, there's nous has become a variety. Nous is broken into a variety. There's many of them, which of course is never true for Aristotle or for Thomas. So we see nous only on the side of the, not on the side of the promise, which is sort of with the pragma and the natur or Natureinstellung, which then makes it more complicated to ask whether the orientation is useful. We're trying to find an ultimate orientation, so then we know we're on a stable ground vis-a-vis this sort of free-floating of not propounding and not saying what we believe and what we're acting on. The dogma, first when we talk about dogma, it's meant that we've straightened out some foolishness in our natural opinions. And so originally the dogmatic was meant to be something where somebody would say, this is the truth. And then they present it as the truth. And others should try to learn this. So just as we've learned this rules of grammar, which are often, if one look at the Tornsock version, one can start to see why. They're supposed to have a sound reasoning. So, like, for instance, somebody told me in a post I'd written, instead of saying have, I'd said of. and they said this is incorrect, and you should thank me for telling you that it's incorrect, because you've been enlightened, you've experienced the Haksala at one of its deeper levels, which would be as it were, what does one call it? The people come to, in their diaspora, to a foreign land, but then they become half Christian. They become half Christian after the diaspora, and this is a kind of assimilation. They assimilate. But this assimilation, which separates like the Ashkenazi Jews from other Jews. Ashkenazi Jews are basically half Christian Jews, in other words. And they've assimilated. But then, we'll get into a situation where there's a lot of difficulties there. But let's reset. Okay, so Heidegger sees the ground where we split between this constant ratiocination. So in the ancient version, ratiocination, but then in the background of the ancient version, the thing that Freud said, because that's in the Politeia of Plato, right? Freud said, look at this nightmare of the Athenians, this situation of the Oedipal complex, and so on. This was known to Plato, and Strauss actually says Plato deliberately did this, but he said this, we can't prove that by the text, but that's just what he thinks. Plato said, we'll stick with dialogic, or we'll stick with the Platonic dialectic, which is actually just the question and answer of Socrates, which we see through Socratic dialogues. We could call it every dialogue of Plato pretty much is Socratic dialogue. Maybe there's one or two that don't involve Socrates. One of them only by sort of technicality or whatever, because in the nomoi, or the laws, there's an Athenian stranger rather than Socrates. But the Athenian stranger might be plausibly assumed to be an imaginative version of if Socrates had not taken the hemlock, but instead fled to Syracuse as Plato himself had done 3 times. And as Heidegger had done in joining the Nazi Party early on, one can say that's Heidegger's trip to the tyrant. So what we need to bring out here to see Heidegger's position is that, in Hegel, he identifies still with the problem of the one and the many in Heraclitus. But Heidegger asks, what is the ground, as it were, on which this is all placed? And partially, in order to approach this question, which you can't get at, he then looks at the full span of how it's been approached. It's from this logos ratiocination version, where Plato deliberately blocks out the things that later come back in, through focusing on the logos, Christ logos, through focusing on, because logos means originally speech, but then of course it comes to mean not just reason, but it comes to mean all this things associated with the Sacred Heart and so on. This agape and this sort of Yanisites. This sort of like what Dostoevsky says. See, Dostoevsky is better, but with the Christian mystics in the West, it's worse, because I think maybe it's in the Russian tradition too, I guess. But in a way, mysticism, Heidegger says, is just a flip side of saying there's no images, there's no nothing, but you're experiencing God. But the point I'm trying to make is more clearly, to me, the orientation is more clearly what Dostoevsky says is, truth is all very good. He's trained as an engineer and everything. But if it comes to the contest, I'll stay with Christ. So this is much more, he knows there's the eigen person. He knows there's a living God. And so it's like is saying, yeah, there could be this other thing, statements about truth, and maybe Dostoevsky doesn't say this, but maybe their problem is they're put in the form of predications, or maybe it's because they're said at a given time, and there's the metaphysics of presentism is attacking us as it attacks the Americans in the American history associations, which all the American historians that have PhDs in history subscribe. This problem of presentism. That's really interesting to know. There's like some historians that don't subscribe to historicism, but it seems almost impossible because there's this like the thing that marks you out as sophisticated in the first place as a historian is you're reading this. I think the guy's name is Carr, C-A-R-R, but I know there's also some better books about the problems about how unobvious many of the problems of doing history are. That there's a book, and it has in it the phrase something like the Norman. What is it? The battle. It's a battle that took place in England about very early on. About is it 10? I can't think of the date. 1066. But doesn't it involve a certain city? The battle that took place in 1066 in England, and then it's said in this book that there's already 3 mistakes in this statement. Of course, it made it worse, but I think it's because it was stated as like 1066 AD, and well, it's not just that you have the issue of the Gregorian calendar and all that, but they also have the fact that people in the past made mistakes, and then you rely on the manuscripts and so on, and then there's something about the geography of it was wrong. I'm going to say the Battle of Hastings, but I think that's wrong. But there's many questions that are just like require guesses, but to such an extent that just the bare, strong empirical version already is really deranged in history, I believe. Because you're relying on documents, and documents can lie. It's not that easy. There's a few books like that I've read many years ago that are very strong on that. But, okay, aside from that, we have this situation where what Heidegger's saying is there's all these theories about our Geschichte, or our fate, and they're presented in different ways, especially since the 19th century when history became a profession. Before that, you had guys like Gibbon or whatever, but there's like wrote those histories because they wanted to, because it was their hobby. But then when you get the profession, you get different things that are happening. Such as metaphysics become de rigueur in some sense. They have to take a position on various things and on whether history could be neutral, like an ology, or whether history has a special condition, or whether, as the Auguste Comte said, that history ultimately is in some kind of it's super. I say it's superimposed, but I guess it's in harmony. I should say it's in harmony with the ultimate findings of Newtonian and Leibnizian physics and so on, or whatever physics may come, with positivist datum. I mean, this is the positivist view, which is just, I think, like, you see obvious sort of versions of it, and I mean, most scientists are indoctrinated into it, but you see obvious versions of it in people like Richard Dawkins. I mean, obviously, exactly what Auguste Comte, MTE, said in his gigantic system. Like, I read, like, I don't know, 400 pages of it or something like that, but it's like way bigger than that. It's like bigger than the Summa. I want to read all of Comte. But it's like, yeah, there's very exact things he says. But if you want to get like the whole gist, then just look at somebody like Richard Dawkins, and that's a mentality, and that's a real mentality. I mean, it actually happens like that. People are born like that. They get indoctrinated into it, and it fits their disposition probably, and so on. But if everyone were more like that, it would be a different world, a different tossing. And therefore, in this way, one wants to say a different natura, a different coming forward of itself. But when we juxtapose that to, say, the Hindus, so like in my ultimate projects, I was mentioning this, that in everything Hindu, you get the assumption of reincarnation. So then you get the assumption, but if we ask the question, what do the Hindus understand by physis, what the Greeks understand by physis, which is really developed out of just a word that meant something like growth and care and maybe traits in some way. And therefore it was developed sort of like consciously, as it were, and therefore in a certain way arbitrarily, to mean what comes forward of itself. What's the closest concept like that in the Vedas or Upanishads or other Hindu texts? It's the most common term. It's dharma, but we don't think of dharma as meaning the same thing as nature, do we? But that's the closest you get. So when you see physis taken as natural attitude as against theoretical attitude, which has this idiotic, in our current lingo, they use this idiotic terms ontology and epistemology, and they claim epistemology is already in the corresponding dialogue in Plato. Is it the Timaeus? I think it's in the Timaeus. The dialogue where he's asking the question of like, is this a dream or not, and which kind of knowledge is the most. I can never remember Timaeus or Theaetetus. I should revisit those. But in any case, because these questions have been some way asked there, but I mean, it's just asked in like a few words, like, oh, this could be a dream. Yeah, it could be a dream. But we don't really care because that's not really our subject anyway. Our subject is ratiocination, and ratiocination as it brings us up to true knowledge or something higher or something. It sort of gives you the same thing as the doctrine in the seventh letter and so on. But Heidegger is saying here, nature, it's a specific concept that arose anthropologically at a certain time. Theory, it's a specific concept that's not even that easy to understand. Except that we just say the lowest stage of episteme for Plato is 2 + 2 is 4, but then we don't, if we're a bit thoughtful, then we're sort of like, but is that just like a formula, like every time I say 2 + 2 it's 4? Well, no, okay, there's something called subitizing, and even animals can create little groups, but then you ask yourself, is it really that 4 people are totally equal? But it's not just 4 people, it could be 4 atoms that are like have different histories under different. Is there really this All-Gleich situation of maths, and what does it mean? And it opens up all kinds of questions and so on. But okay, so there's a specific set of questions that goes along with the notion of the theoretical, which goes back for over like 26 centuries or whatever. And on the other, but we see when we're thrown into this situation that Hegel was in a rudimentary way thrown into, that there's a world question, and that any attempt to nationalize would be a rump action, because that already happened in 1848. That was the springtide of nations. But now any attempt to be merely national, because of the closeness of all things, because of the world system, because of the indivisibility of security, is merely a rump action. So it's like Nietzsche has already long since seen this, even in the 19th century, but he was the early one to see it. But yes, you have many conclusions and many beliefs and many identities, many. So you have, again, like somebody like Dawkins with his specific beliefs and all that. We could argue about like how much of it is an innate disposition, how much was he bred into it because maybe he was in a society that had positivist beliefs for several generations, and they sort of selectively breed towards people that were more disposed towards this imbecilism. So yeah, but nonetheless, all I'm trying to point out is Richard Dawkins actually exists. He's a real person. He has the beliefs he believes. What if more people were like that? So likewise, yeah, we could focus on these different problems of the theoretical attitude as it superimposes itself over the natural attitude, or what people spontaneously believe because they're bred into it, as we all are. And then we could ask, to what extent is it, do we merely cast ourselves, is the breaking from this merely a casting into a super theoretical attitude, or what extent is it philosophy, a way of life, and then we go back and forth, and then we become like Hegel. But instead Heidegger's saying, couldn't we in this storm actually recognize a new position that sees both natural and theoretical as requiring this Seinfragen question to ask it, and at the same time we could superimpose the first questions in Hegel's logic, which are at the same time the same thing as in Bergson. Henri Bergson just reverses that. These questions of being, negation, and becoming, and how they go together. These questions are then, we could juxtapose against the question of the promise, or the natural common sense that says that Mendetzach is better, or against this pathless, which says that the negativity or the Tornsock is better. But Heidegger asks, what is the ground out of which both this selection is being presented to us as our highest way of making selections, as the most comprehensive way of making selections, as the revelation and the prospect that that human beings who are the most, let's say, self-respecting and serious about what knowledge is, what must show themselves, and supposedly must even subscribe